Are you out of your mind? Calling the police on your own family? My mother's shrill scream pierced through my eardrums. The voice shattered like shards of glass, scattering in all directions as it absorbed the afternoon light pouring in through the large living room window. It echoed across the polished floorboards of the house I had earned after 10 years of labor, filling the space with a grating sound. I quietly pressed the end call button on my smartphone and looked up at my mother, whose face had turned bright red as she stood before me like a guardian statue at a temple gate. Her eyes were wide open with rage and disbelief, glaring at me as if I had transformed into some incomprehensible monster. Beside her, my father stood speechless, his gray lips trembling faintly as he watched the catastrophe unfold before his eyes. And near the sofa, my younger sister Brooke had collapsed onto the floor, crying hysterically like a stage actress. "I'm perfectly sane." I answered in a voice so calm it even startled me. I observed myself objectively, checking whether my voice trembled, whether my fingers were shaking. I was fine. Calm. This is undoubtedly my house. Anyone who tries to live here without my permission is a trespasser, even if they're family. That's the rule of society. A few minutes earlier, Brooke had swung open the front door without knocking, marching in like a triumphant general with her 3 children behind her, and declared, "Mom and Dad said it's fine. From today, this is our castle." Her voice carried no malice, no doubt, just a pure assertion of what she believed to be her right. That made me even angrier. This house was my dream home, the living room with its 20-foot ceilings, the beautiful island kitchen. Everything was exactly as I had envisioned for years. But now, toys had spilled out of half-open suitcases and scattered across the floor like landmines, and on my beloved white rug lay the crushed remains of cookies smeared into stains by tiny hands. The walls were scribbled with what appeared to be crayon drawings, abstract, chaotic, like avant-garde art. My sanctuary had turned into a lawless zone in mere minutes, so I called the police. Brooke, still sobbing, screamed at me. "Unbelievable! Monster! Devil! Do you even have a human heart?" Then my father spoke up. "Natalie, that's enough. Your sister is in trouble. As her older sister, it's only natural that you should give in." Natural. That single word burst the dam of self-control I had spent years building deep within my heart. That one word from my father pried open the lid of my memories. My name is Natalie Cooper, 28 years old. For years, as the eldest daughter of the Baker family, I supported them. Natural, you say? Mom, Dad, have you ever once stopped to think about how much risk that so-called natural expectation has carried? My calm yet icy voice made both of my parents fall silent for a moment. I walked over to the cabinet in the living room and took out a thick file from a locked drawer. It was the very record of our family's history of debt, something I had compiled over the past 10 years, weekend after weekend, alone, sipping coffee in silence while forcing my emotions into submission. I appreciate the financial help you gave me when I bought this house, but that was merely a partial repayment of the loans I covered for all of you. I slammed the file down on the coffee table. With a heavy thud, the contents scattered. Bank transfer slips carefully sealed in plastic sleeves, handwritten IOUs bearing my parents' smudged signatures, and even settlement receipts with photos from Brooke's property damage accident. The mountain of papers spread across the table seemed to expose this family's hidden sins under the harsh light of truth, quietly, yet with an overwhelming presence. Each date, amount, and reason was meticulously recorded in my handwriting. The repayment for Brooke's first failed business loan, $50,000. The online organic cosmetics store she swore would definitely succeed, closed down in just 6 months. And you both told me, failures when you're young are valuable lessons, before asking me to cover her debt. The penalty for her second influencer attempt? $30,000. That was the result of her breaking a corporate contract on a whim. And of course, the one I could never forget, the settlement that changed everything for me. That was 2 years ago. Brooke had caused a property damage accident while driving the brand new SUV our parents had just bought her. In the middle of the night, the shrill sound of the phone jolted me awake. On the other end, my sister's panicked screaming instantly erased any trace of sleepiness. The first person Brooke called was me. "Help me, Natalie. I can't tell Mom and Dad. They'll kill me." Her desperate cries were laced with the faint wail of sirens in the background. Of course, there was no way to keep it secret from our parents. Soon enough, all 3 of them came begging to me in tears. "It'll ruin her future. We'll handle it somehow. Just cover it for now." At that time, my bank account still held the funds I had been saving for my next goal, separate from the down payment for this dream home. Because buying this house wasn't the end. It was only the first stage of my life plan. I had been saving that money to buy my very first investment studio apartment. That is a foundation for my future real estate ventures, and the first step toward achieving true financial independence using this house as my starting point. I couldn't sleep that night. After hours of agonizing, I finally sent the money the next morning with trembling hands. I still remember how heavy my finger felt when I clicked the transfer button, as if I were slicing away a piece of my own future with a single click. Even so, the house was completed just as I had planned. The 20-foot-high ceiling in the living room, the beautiful island kitchen, everything I had ever dreamed of. The funds for the investment apartment vanished into thin air, but I forced myself to accept it, telling myself that if it could bring peace back to my family, then so be it. I could always save again. My life plan was merely delayed a little. That's what I tried to believe. But what truly pushed me into despair was what Brooke said afterward. "I'm saved, Natalie. Now I can film new videos again." She smiled brightly, posing in front of the SUV she had crashed, and uploaded the photo to social media. The post was captioned with frivolous hashtags. "Trouble happened, but I'm back. Thanks, sis." There was no sign of remorse or gratitude on her face. Because of her reckless mistake, the second chapter of my life was wiped clean before it could even begin. From that moment on, my loans ceased to be an act of duty. They became evidence. Evidence I would one day use to settle this toxic relationship once and for all. And the total amount is... I turned to the last page and pointed to the number written in red ink. $127,548, without interest. That's how much it comes to. Now tell me, can you still condemn me after seeing this? I could see the blood drain from my parents' faces. My father reached out with a trembling hand to pick up one of the IOUs, then stopped midway. His fingers hovered in the air as though afraid to touch his own sins. My mother covered her mouth, releasing a faint, broken gasp. They were finally seeing the undeniable proof, how irresponsibly they had feasted on my goodwill and my future. For the first time, they understood that this was no mere sibling quarrel. This was reckoning, a reckoning they could no longer escape. The living room fell into a silence so deep it resembled a graveyard. No one dared to breathe, afraid of what might come next. Then, the silence was shattered by the mechanical, emotionless sound of knocking at the front door. It was heavier than any noise that had ever echoed through this house, a sound like a final verdict. I looked up toward the ceiling, took a steadying breath, and walked firmly to open the door. Standing there, just as I expected, were two police officers, their expressions stern and unyielding. The older man glanced once at the chaos in the living room and at the family's ashen faces, and with tired eyes that seemed to say, "Not this kind of trouble again," he let out a small sigh. His years of experience must have allowed him to instantly read the complex and troublesome emotions swirling in this household. When they stepped into the living room, their mere presence rapidly drained the hysterical heat that had been filling the air. "You are Natalie Cooper, who was reported, correct?" I nodded quietly, and they asked me to explain the situation. After telling the officers I would speak with them, I walked to the study adjacent to the living room. From the top drawer of the steel filing cabinet, always kept locked, I pulled out a stack of documents in clear sleeves. They were copies, notarized at the public notary, of the deed to the house, the mortgage agreements, and the official registration papers proving I am the sole owner. As you can see, this property belongs to me. The mortgage and taxes are all being paid from my income, and this woman is my sister, but I did not grant her permission to live here. The older officer carefully scanned the documents with his eyes, tracing key passages with a finger as he whispered something to the younger officer beside him. Then he turned to my father and, in a calm but unmistakably authoritative tone, asked for confirmation. "Sir, is it correct that the documents state that your daughter, Natalie Cooper, is the sole legal owner of this property?" My father, apparently too drained to argue, let his gaze wander with a deathly pale face and then gave a single, weak nod. That tiny motion marked the complete collapse of his authority in this house. It was his white flag. Having obtained my father's agreement, the older officer turned finally to Brooke. His gaze no longer aimed to mediate a family quarrel, but carried the cold light of one who enforces the law. "Ma'am, I'm afraid you cannot remain in this dwelling without the permission of the legal owner. As of this moment, your actions are considered trespassing under state law. Trespassing? Brooke repeated the word as if it were a foreign language she had never before heard. The officer's clinical declaration far exceeded anything she could immediately comprehend. As the meaning of his words slowly sank in, her expression changed from astonishment to anger, and then to a despairing panic. In her world, demands made in the name of family had always been permissible. That absolute rule was now crumbling before her very eyes. And then, in the next instant, "Don't you dare!" A piercing, blood-curdling shriek rattled the living room windows. It was no longer a human voice, but something like a beast's roar. "How can you be my sister and do this? Calling the police on me? I have 3 children. Do you care what happens to them? Are you going to leave us on the street? Are you even human?" Brooke clenched the terrified children to her chest as she screamed and cried. It looked less like a mother protecting her children and more like a hostage-taker barricading herself in. She desperately tried to prove, with tears and loud cries, how powerless, pitiable, and deserving of protection she was. It was the ultimate, last weapon she had used again and again throughout her life, and it always worked. A tearful appeal for sympathy. Since childhood, her tears had always wrung concessions from our parents and forced me to endure. For her, tears were a magic wand. But that weapon held no sway over an enforcer of the law. The older officer remained unmoved by her hysterical screaming and spoke quietly but firmly. "Your personal circumstances are not taken into account here. Our duty is to protect the rights of the owner under the law. If you do not leave promptly, we will arrest you for trespassing." The word arrest, a word that should have been foreign to her life, fell coldly. At that sound, Brooke's crying stopped at once, and she collapsed to the floor. As if the puppet strings had been cut, all strength drained from her body. In the heavy silence where the adult shouting had died away, the terrified children's intense cries gradually softened into hiccuping sobs. And then, perhaps exhausted in body and mind, they fell into quiet sleep in their mother's arms. The older officer glanced at the silent family, then turned back to me and asked in a professional tone, "Miss Natalie Cooper, I will confirm the owner's intention. What would you like us to do with them from here?" All eyes pierced me. My father's pleading gaze, my mother's frightened look, and my sister collapsed on the floor with hollow eyes. The final decision that would determine this family's fate now rested with me. I took a deep breath and faced the officers. Their gaze no longer saw me merely as a victim, but as the person with ultimate authority here. "I do not want them arrested," I stated firmly. "I only want them to leave this house." The officers nodded and began asking procedural questions. Their words barely registered with me. I nodded mechanically a few times and gave some short replies, but my attention had already turned to Brooke, who was sobbing on the floor, and to my parents, who stared at a single point on the floor as if their souls had been stripped away. Sensing my state, the older officer quickly gathered his paperwork and finally said, "Understood. The owner's intention has been confirmed. If they do not leave promptly, please call us again." He exchanged a glance with the younger officer, and the two of them quietly moved toward the front door. Brooke hugged the terrified children to her chest as she screamed and cried, clutching them as if to hold them hostage. It looked less like a mother protecting her children and more like a barricaded intruder taking hostages. She tried desperately, with tears and loud cries, to prove how powerless, pitiable, and deserving of protection she was. It was the ultimate and final weapon she had repeatedly used throughout her life, and it always worked, a tearful appeal for sympathy. Since childhood, her tears had consistently wrung concessions from our parents and forced me to endure. For her, tears were a magic wand, but that weapon had no effect on an enforcer of the law. The older officer, unshaken by her hysterical screams, spoke quietly, but firmly. "Your personal circumstances will not be taken into consideration here. Our duty is to protect the rights of the owner under the law. If you do not leave promptly, we will arrest you for trespassing." The word arrest, a word that should have been foreign to her life, fell coldly. At that sound, Brooke's crying stopped immediately, and she slumped to the floor. As if the puppet strings had been cut, all strength drained from her body. In the heavy silence after the adult shouting subsided, the terrified children's intense cries gradually softened into hiccuping sobs. And then, exhausted both physically and mentally, they turned into quiet sleeping breaths in their mother's arms. The older officer glanced at the silent family and then turned to me, asking in a professional tone, "Miss Cooper, I need to confirm the owner's intent. What would you like us to do with them from here?" All eyes pierced me. My father's pleading look, my mother's frightened eyes, and my sister collapsed on the floor with hollow eyes. The final decision that would determine this family's fate now rested with me. I took a deep breath and faced the officers. Their gaze no longer saw me merely as a victim, but as the person with ultimate authority here. "I do not want them arrested," I said firmly. "I only want them to leave this house." The officers nodded and began procedural questioning. Their words hardly registered with me. I nodded mechanically a few times and gave short replies, but my attention was already fixed on Brooke, sobbing on the floor, and on my parents, who stared vacantly at a single point on the floor as if their souls had been stripped away. Sensing my state, the older officer quickly organized his paperwork and finally said, "Understood. The owner's intent has been confirmed. If they do not vacate promptly, please call us again." He exchanged a look with the younger officer, and the two of them quietly headed for the front door. A mechanical latch clicked, and once again, only our family was left alone in the living room. That sound marked the moment I faced the three of them again. It would be a lie to say I felt no pity, but sympathy is the greatest enemy when it comes to severing this warped relationship. If I showed mercy here, the same pattern would repeat. That would benefit neither them nor, above all, myself. I do not intend to throw you out onto the street immediately. I continued calmly but solemnly, like a judge delivering a sentence. Everyone held their breath, waiting for my words. The living room was taut with tension, and the earlier frenzy felt like a distant falsehood. Only the children's small sleeping breaths echoed in this abnormal space. There are two options. Listen carefully. 1, I will advance the money to rent a nearby short-term apartment. I will cover the security deposit and the first month's rent, but this is a loan. Brooke must find stable work within 1 month and present me with a legally binding repayment plan. If she fails to meet that promise, the lease will be terminated immediately and she will have to vacate. "And the second option?" my father asked in a hoarse, barely audible voice. "The second option is to seek a public shelter. There, basic food, clothing, and lodging will be provided, and there should be support to help find work. Which you choose is up to you. But remember this, you chose to hand over my house because you could not refuse Brooke's demands, and this is the result of that worst choice. This is the last real chance I am offering you." There was no pity or sentiment in my words. This was not charity. It was the last, painfully thin lifeline to get them standing on their own 2 feet. To grab that line or to shake it off was their decision. Brooke rejected my offer. "Fine, I won't take your help. I will take the children and go to a shelter." Perhaps that was the last scrap of pride left for her. Her expression showed a grim resolve. If she must cling to the pitifulness she had always used to survive, she would rather fall to rock bottom than beg her sister's pity. She said that, then violently woke the sleeping children, grabbed her luggage roughly, and stormed out of the house like a whirlwind. The sound of the front door closing rang like a gunshot, announcing both the end and the beginning of this house. My parents cried out, "Brooke!" and attempted to follow, but I grabbed their shoulders and held them back. "Wait." At my quiet yet commandingly final voice, the two of them halted. They looked at me as if stranded in a stranger's house, bewildered and lost. "I want to ask something. Why did you do that? Why did you try to give away my house without my permission?" My father opened his mouth as if to say something, then stopped. His mouth no longer showed anger, only deep confusion and defeat. It was my mother who finally broke the silence. "We couldn't say no." She spoke in a faint voice, her head lowered. "When she came to us crying, saying she wanted to live here with her children, we couldn't turn her away. We were afraid of disappointing her." My father continued where she left off. "Brooke has always thrown tantrums whenever she couldn't get what she wanted. To calm her down, we always made you endure things. We spoiled her at your expense. And this time was no different. We're weak, Natalie." It was the truth I had always known deep down, but had never heard spoken aloud from their lips. Every act of financial dependence, every selfish decision, it had all stemmed from their weakness. They said nothing more. No, they couldn't say more. Having confessed their sins, the two of them walked toward the front door in silence, their movements awkward and unsteady, like strangers leaving a house that was no longer theirs. The small metallic click of the door closing echoed unnaturally loud through the wide living room. That sound snapped the taut thread of tension inside me. I sank to the floor and, for the first time in my own home, cried quietly, stifling my sobs. That night, I spent the hours alone in the vast, silent living room. For the first 2 days, my phone remained silent. Perhaps it was her final act of pride. During that time, I picked up my phone again and again, questioning myself. Was this really the right choice? But each time, the file of IOUs left on the table silently reminded me that my decision had not been wrong. Then, on the third night, an unfamiliar number appeared on the screen. It was Brooke. "Hello, Natalie?" Her voice was nothing like the hysterical tone I'd heard just days before. It was thin, worn out, and trembling. The reality of the shelter. It was so much harsher than I imagined. On the other end of the line, Brooke began to speak haltingly. The smell of disinfectant clinging to the hard vinyl cot. The constant noise of a shared room where privacy didn't exist. The sound of someone sobbing in the darkness at night. Her 3 children silently eating the cold, tasteless food they were given. Her youngest son crying after another child took his favorite toy. And the helplessness of being unable to protect him. No one cared about her influencer talent or her dreams of making it someday. No one listened. They simply cast indifferent glances and went on with their own struggles. There, the tricks she had always relied on, sympathy and dependence, no longer worked. Everyone was too consumed by survival to care about anyone else's story. "For the first time, I realized how fortunate I've been," she said quietly. "I always believed deep down that if I showed up at your house, you'd complain but still take care of me and the kids. I took your kindness for granted, Natalie." Perhaps those were the words I had wanted to hear all along. After a breath, I answered calmly. "The first option I offered still stands. If you're truly ready to start over, come to my house in a few days. Alone. We'll sign the contract and discuss what comes next." I heard her gasp softly. Then, with a strained but resolute voice, she said, "All right, I'll come. I promise." For the first time in her life, Brooke was standing on the bare ground of reality without anyone's protection. A few days later, she appeared at my door, just as promised, her face pale and tired. The children, she said, were being looked after by our parents for the time being. We sat across from each other in the kitchen, for the first time, as equals. "I'm truly sorry," she said, bowing her head deeply. "I'll find a job. Any job. Please, give me one more chance. I'll accept every condition you set." Her eyes were sincere. I nodded silently and placed the loan agreement and a list of short-term apartments on the table. Despite my stern tone, I ladled a bowl of warm soup for her. She took one sip and broke down in tears. They weren't manipulative tears meant to draw sympathy. They were genuine tears, of remorse, of acceptance, of someone finally ready to begin again. A month passed after Brooke moved into her apartment and began working part-time at a local cafe. Then, one weekend, my parents came to visit. They looked unusually formal. In my father's hands was an old, dust-covered family album. Sitting together on the living room sofa, he turned the pages until he stopped on one showing me as a child, holding a thick book at the library, smiling proudly. "Natalie," he said softly. My father looked straight at me, his eyes deep within the wrinkles etched across his face. "We relied on you because you always said you were fine. You could do anything on your own and never complained. We told ourselves you were strong enough to endure a little more and that it wouldn't hurt you. That day when Brooke came to us crying and said she wanted to live in your house, we couldn't refuse. We didn't want to disappoint her, so we decided, without even asking you, to offer your home. We've spent our lives spoiling her at your expense. I'm truly sorry." My mother, eyes brimming with tears, spoke next. "When Brooke cried and demanded something, I always got scared and gave in. And deep down, I relied on you to quietly fix everything afterward. Your silence was kindness, but we mistook it for strength. We leaned on that kindness and ran away from our responsibilities as parents. I'm so sorry, Natalie." For the first time, they spoke clearly about the truth behind all the financial dependence, the selfish decisions, and the chain of indulgence. It was the sincere, unvarnished apology I had been waiting for, without excuses, without blame. 6 months later, soft light and the sound of laughter filled the kitchen of my home. Wearing her part-time cafe uniform, Brooke stood at the counter with her children, cutting cookie dough into shapes. From her apron pocket, she pulled out a slightly crumpled pay stub and showed it to me with pride. Look, Natalie, I already transferred next month's rent. I even managed to save a little this time. The tips were really good. Her smile no longer carried that careless, dependent sweetness. Instead, it shone with the quiet confidence of a woman who had finally learned to stand on her own. Our parents sat on the couch, reading picture books to the grandchildren. Between pages, my mother looked up and said, "Next weekend, we'll help with your garden. Let's plant the tomato seedlings together." They no longer came here to clean up Brooke's messes, but simply to enjoy time as a family. We had begun to build a relationship not of dependence, but of mutual respect. Each of us standing on our own feet, yet supporting one another. Wrapped in the sweet scent drifting from the oven and the warmth of the family I loved, I lifted my coffee cup and smiled quietly. It was because of that stormy day that we could finally be here now. A house is not just a building. It is a fortress that protects one's dignity, and only by maintaining the right distance can it truly become a place of peace. By learning where the real boundaries lie, we had finally become a true family.